This episode of Let's Dig Deeper podcast is supported by the University of Copenhagen School of Archaeology. Welcome, dear listener, to Let's Dig Deeper, the podcast where we talk all about archaeology, history, art, and culture. My name is Zinat Haroun. I am a student of classical archaeology here at the University of Copenhagen, and in this podcast, I'm going to take you along for interviews with some of the amazing people working in the field. We'll talk with archaeologists, historians, professionals, and beyond. And hopefully we'll learn more about the past in the process. And today I'm joined by two super cool guests, textile archaeologist Eva Andersson Strand and Elsa Yvanez. Welcome to the studio, both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And Eva, you are professor of archaeology here at the University of Copenhagen. You are the head of the School of Archaeology, and you were the previous head of the Center for Textile Research. Your research interest primarily lies in the archaeology of textile production in Northern Europe and the areas around the Mediterranean. And you're currently leading a research team on the project Textile Resources in Viking Age Landscapes, or Trival, where you're working to understand the substantial demand for textile resources and its impact on land use and settlement structures in Denmark. Very, very interesting. And Elsa, you are Associate Professor of Textile Archaeology, also here at University of Copenhagen at the Center for Textile Research. And since 2022, you've been leading the research project Fashioning Sudan. And with that project, you and your team are aiming to understand and examine the archaeology of dress practices along the Middle Nile. So both very extremely qualified for our topic today, which is textile archaeology in all its facets. But before we really dig into it, what exactly is textile archaeology and why should we be interested in ancient textiles in the first place?
I think that textile archaeology is as equally important as all archaeology. Archaeology is very much about material culture, and to exclude textiles is a big mistake. We all need textiles. We need them from that we are born to we pass away, and that is not something that is new. That was the same in ancient societies. So by excluding textile archaeology is excluding a big part of our past.
Yeah. All right. Thank you so much. And with that now defined, let's dig deeper. So, we've established why we should care about ancient textiles. But when people think about archaeology, textiles are probably not the very first thing that comes to mind. So, why are textiles such an important source for understanding past societies?
Yeah, through textile, like in many other type of organic material, we actually touch a huge part of the past material landscape because, of course, a lot of things were not made in stone and ceramics. We have a lot of other organics, and textiles were used for many different uses in daily life, in death as well. So through textile objects, we can really study many different aspects of past lives. And that's when we think about using the textiles. But then, of course, there are all the aspects behind their production. You can make textiles out of many different fibers, from animal or from plants. So through textiles, you also have access to, let's say, larger topics such as agriculture, pastoral practices, and then, of course, production, daily life practices around work and work people and knowledge and all of this. So through one textile object, you really can explore different aspects of the past.
Yeah, and what I find really fascinating about textiles is that they survive under very specific conditions. And when we as archaeologists come across them, they're not always very well preserved, quite the opposite usually. So why are ancient textiles so difficult to preserve, and where do we usually find them?
Well, we usually find them in burials if there is not some very specific fine conditions, like if it's very dry or if it's very cold and waterlogged and so on. And that is, of course, one of the reasons. And that is also a challenge that we find so many textiles in the burials, because are that the same type of textiles that was used in daily life? That is something that always have to be discussed. And also that textiles are very often preserved on metal objects, and there are a lot of metal objects in very rich burials, so that also tells us something about the status of the burial.
Yeah.
So that is also something that we have to bear in mind. It's not that often in the Northern Europe that we find textiles in settlement context, and not at least at the period I'm working with, which is late Iron Age and Viking Age. And we have some examples of textiles that are found in harbour area. And that also tells us something very interesting about the use of the textiles. Because those textiles that are found in old harbour areas, they are found because they have been reused. And that is, I also think, is a big reason why we don't find so much textiles, because they have been used, they have been resewn, they have been used again. So they are nearly fibers again when you stop using them.
Yeah, they would be used up, actually.
Yeah, exactly.
And there is quite an, I think, a dichotomy depending on where you work, like the climatic environment of your region, the region under study. Because I guess you're right, we tend to think about textiles as a rather rare material in archaeology in Europe. But personally, I work in desertic areas, I work in Egypt, and I work with Sudanese material. And in that case, we have almost the reverse problem. We have too many.
Okay.
So we have such great quantities in some sites. So again, it's a very specific preservation. So some sites we have zero, but when textiles are preserved, then we have many. And when we encounter other problems, we have to have quantitative methods because it's just too difficult to deal with. And then we deal with methods sometimes that are closer to what our colleagues have developed, for example, for pottery, for ceramics, because also it's similar problems, large quantities and fragmentary pieces.
Yeah.
So it very much depends on the areas you're working in. But of course, as in any other archaeology, we are dealing with a record that is biased anyway, and that is biased towards, as Eva mentioned, burial and elite contexts.
Yeah. And when we do find preserved textiles and fabric, as you say, they're often in these tiny fragments or almost a disintegrating state. So how can we study something that's so fragmentary?
Yeah, so with the material that I work with personally, but with other colleagues working in Egypt, for example, we actually have quite a lot of big pieces, rarely complete, but still. So we tend to record this in great details to reach really like the maximum state of documentation that we can, so that then we can eventually study all the fragments and compare them with what we know from more complete pieces. That said, in a small piece of textile, whatever it is, you actually find already a lot of information. So it's not necessarily the size that makes the interest in that case, because you can have something that as big as a postage stamp, really, but you already can know something about the fiber, you can know something about the method that was used to make the thread, the method that was used to make the weave, and from that you can already extrapolate quite a lot. So it really depends, but sometimes even the tiniest of fragments can be important.
Yes, and I think Elsa is absolutely right. We can get a lot of information from a very tiny fragment. And now we talk about fragments. There are some scholars or colleagues that think that they are quite boring, those small fragments, until we tell them what you can really gain from them. But we should also remember that the fragments have been in the ground for many, sometimes thousands of years. They have changed in color, for example.
Yeah.
So if we look at the Bronze Age textiles that are from the oak coffins so well preserved in Denmark, of course they are brown today, but they have not been that from the beginning. They have not been dyed. That is what the analyses have shown, at least. But they have been made in different wool colors, for example.
Yeah.
We also consider them as quite coarse, but that is also something that we evaluate in a way. I mean, what is coarse in the Bronze Age might not be in coarse in the Bronze Age, and the fibers are very fine. So there are many different aspects when you study the textiles.
Yeah. So there are different methods to, as you say, fiber study and weave structure and things like that. And you've hinted at it a little bit, but what can we then learn from a single textile fragment? I mean, what kind of specific information can you usually extract from it? I'm thinking things like material, skill level, trade.
I mean, textile research is truly interdisciplinary. We work with many, many different methods, and that's archaeology in a way. So, I mean, the fiber analysis tell us something about the resources that were available. The spin angle, the weaving technique, tell us something about the techniques that they used at a certain time. We always have to compare the textiles with the context they are from, which I think is really, really important. Even if we in northern Scandinavia, when we are talking about Viking Age, for example, have a lot of fragments, we also do have a lot of textile tools. And the tools also tell us quite a lot about what have been produced, what type of qualities. So it is the combination of different sources and different contexts. When we put that together, then we learn something about the impact of textile production at a given time, at a given society.
Yeah.
Yes, they can also be very much completed beyond the textile to incorporate them in the context of production, as Eva said, but also the context of use. So even from a tiny fragment, depending on its location, you can, for example, infer what it was used in an outfit on a specific garment, which you can also compare with sometimes iconographic sources that can teach you how the piece was worn on the body. And in that case, your sources become sort of like in dialogue with each other, and you also need a lot of different colleagues and experts that bring their own specialty. For example, with funerary textiles, it becomes very interesting to work with anthropologists so that you can actually better understand the role of textiles together with the body that used it every day.
Yeah, so it's sort of like a team effort to solve this mystery. Both of your work engages with reconstruction of ancient methods and technologies of textile production. So how important would you say that experimental archaeology is for understanding ancient textiles?
I think that experimental archaeology is a very important part in the understanding for textiles and textile production. But I also think it's important to mention craft knowledge in general. I mean, there are many of the old ancient techniques that are still alive today, and that is something that we have to consider and something that we have to learn from. However, there are very few places where they produce textiles that they produced 1,000 or 2,000 years ago. Just one example, for example, we have the warp-weighted loom, a special loom type that was used here in the Viking Age, but it was also used up till the 20th century and investigated by scholar Marta Hoffman, who traveled around in northern Scandinavia, visit the weavers that were still weaving on this loom type. However, when Marta in the 1950s and 1960s met the weavers, they were producing rugs, very, very coarse rugs, and they had loom weights could weigh 4, 5, 6 kilos.
Okay, wow.
Yeah, exactly.
That's very heavy for
That's very, very
weight,
heavy. Yeah, it is. So extremely coarse textiles, nothing that you use for clothing or for costume. So there is where experimental archaeology comes in, because by learning from Marta Hoffman's weaver, we know about how to do the setup, how to do the weaving. But from archaeology, we know about the loom weights, we know about the qualities, we know about the fibers.
Yeah.
So what we do in experimental archaeology is that we combine those sources, the archaeology with the ethnography, and then we made a test. But we can never be able to say that it was made exactly this way. No. But we get an idea about different variations of how it could have been produced and so on. So therefore, experimental archaeology for me has become really important to also to test different tools together with craftspeople, always with craftspeople.
Yeah, and to visualize what the ancient product would have been. Yeah.
But it's also important to work with the correct tools, with the correct fibers, and to really understand what you are doing. Otherwise, it can be totally misleading.
Has that ever happened? An experiment goes totally wrong?
Oh, yeah. Of course it has. Yeah. And that is a part of the experiment. So that is also good. We always learn something for the experiment, but it's important when we then take the results and include it in our interpretation of the past.
Yeah. And to be like, so this works, this doesn't work, this is how they could have done it.
That is how we could have done it, but could it have also been done another way? But that's all, again, that's archaeology.
Yeah.
Another very important aspect of experimental archaeology in textile research, and you have mentioned one of them, you said visuality. It's very important to visualize things, but we're actually using experimental archaeology to go a little bit beyond just what you do with your eyes, and also have a better understanding of other types of senses, so sensory assessment and sensory recording. How does it feel to wear a kind of textile, or what does it feel to weave a type of textiles? Of course, we cannot completely understand what people in the past were feeling. We are very far away from them, from a different culture, a different time period, and we conceive our bodies differently. But we can still use sort of the human body as the ground zero of the analysis and question the way that all of us feel and experience textiles every day. So that is also another important part of the experimentations that we are carrying out at the moment in CTR.
Yeah, that sort of pure human impression that you can get from something that's been reconstructed but is still sort of giving you the same maybe feeling that it could have had back then.
Yeah, and this is where it's very important to then take experimental archaeology from production to use, because we can't really truly assess this if we are working with reconstructions that are not as close as we can as the original.
Yeah.
Of course, it's very complicated, as Eva mentioned, to reach the level of accuracy because of difficulty to access the right fibers sometimes or right knowledge from the craft people, depending on the experience. But we do our best, and we are always very transparent in the protocol that we are using to sort of like use experimental archaeology, but maybe better to call it experiential archaeology, to bridge this gap between past knowledge and past practices and our understanding of it.
And a third part of experimental or experiential archaeology is also coming back to the production, and that is the movement. I have during all my years never worked with a craftsperson that don't have any pain in her body.
Right.
Shoulders, hands, and so on. So that is also something that we have recorded when the weavers have been weaving or the spinners have been spinning, how they moved the body.
Okay.
And that is something that we're also working with, if it's possible to apply this to our archaeological skeleton or something, to see how has she, because the experiments, we can only do the experiments for a very short time. We cannot stand for 30 years and weave a sail.
No, and have it as a lifestyle. Sort of.
No, exactly. But with motion capture, for example, we can use that and simulate how the body would look like in 10 years
so
and 20 and 30 and 40 years.
Sort of the impact of production on the human body.
And we discussed earlier about what can a tiny fragment tell us. It can tell us a lot. And for example, even if we have a fragment 1 by 1 centimeter, we can still say how many meters of yarn that was used.
Yeah.
And if we then are thinking a bit part of a costume, for example, we can calculate how many meters of yarn that have been used to produce a costume or a part of a costume and so.
And the effort that went into that,
And that is something, I mean, we are coming very easily up in hundreds, thousands of meters of yarn.
Hours
especially
and
when
hours.
we're discussing sailcloth and the extremely fine textiles you have in Sudan and Egypt. It's amazing when you see how much that had been produced.
It's very easy to maybe focus a lot on the weave because this is what you see, you know, when you weave the threads together on a loom. But actually what took the most time was spinning. To transform the fibers into threads, as Eva said, you need kilometers of it. And that means that a large part of the population were involved in spinning for hours and hours and hours and hours. And that, of course, has a huge impact on somebody's life and on somebody's body.
And that actually leads me to my next question, which is that most people don't really realize that textile production was often one of the largest industries in the ancient world. And for a long period of time, something that almost all households actually had a hand in. So what does textile archaeology tell us about labor, organization, everyday life? I mean, things like domestic and specialized production.
I would say that this really, really much depends on the society that you are working at the moment. That is very, very specific. And sometimes you have clues from the settlement, for example, the way the tools are distributed in living space, that could give you some information about that. Sometimes you have written sources, such as accounts and things like that, and in that case you are very lucky because you can reach a much, let's say, deeper understanding of the organization of production. So it really depends. In the context where I work a lot, for example, in ancient Sudan, we do not have written sources. The only thing we have are the textiles, and we have tools, usually found in settlements, very often in semi-open spaces, so in courtyards or areas in the courtyards that were covered. So we can imagine that people were making textiles in the courtyards of houses under, for example, a shed or something like this. Yeah, to protect them from the sun and from too harsh of a light. And we don't have any sort of like organized workshops or anything like this. So we don't see a kind of like state organization, let's say, a very controlled organization of the production that is more at the domestic level. So it really depends, and that contrasts with many other areas in the world, of course.
I think you're absolutely right. And that is also one of the challenges in textile archaeology, because as soon as we have written sources, no matter if it's Sumerian or in Egypt or medieval England, we can really read about the impact of textiles and textile production, how much that was traded and so on. But as soon as we do not have the written sources, textile have a tendency to disappear. They become invisible, intangible. Even if we know that they must have produced quite a lot of textiles. I mean, it's so important to remember to look at the resources. Which resources do people have access to? Yeah. Which type of tools did they use? But what type of textiles did they need? And what type of textile did they desire? Yeah. To think that in the history when you are discussing.
You have to do like a complete evaluation of the full context.
Exactly. And we can see changes in the textile production at a given time, at a given society. But when we don't have the written sources, it's harder for us to understand. And it seems like it's also harder for many to understand the importance of textiles.
Yeah, when you can't read about it.
No, exactly.
It doesn't matter anymore.
No.
We also have the case when sometimes we have written sources and we have a lot of preserved textiles and tools, like in Egypt, for example, and then they don't match. They don't necessarily agree. So you are faced with yet another type of conundrum that needs to be tackled when we have, for example, in Tales, something called the Satire of Trades in ancient Egypt, where they talk about the terrible life condition of the weavers that was shackled to the loom all day in the dark and working
in the dark.
And then that's sort of, okay, so this is, of course, a very specific text that was written for a scribal audience. But then all of a sudden, we find tools in houses, or we have a lot of textiles of sometimes extremely fine qualities with absolutely super, super fine threads. But we don't necessarily have the accounts that would track the production of this or to understand sort of like economic system behind it.
So in that case, do you let the textiles then speak for themselves and tell the story, or do you have to sort of believe what the written account says?
And hopefully we'll manage to find a happy middle ground eventually. Historically, in Egyptology, people have been working on textual sources a lot and maybe less on material culture, especially when it comes to textiles. So at the moment, there is a big effort in this field for a lot of different colleagues working to kind of like push the documentation of the material. And with more and more data, hopefully at one point we can have a more constructive meeting with the...
Fingers crossed.
With the written sources.
Yeah.
One thing I feel like I have to mention is the way that textile production is often associated with women in the ancient world. It's typically portrayed as the sort of female skill, and weaving is a craft that has strong feminine connotations even today. So how accurate is that assumption, and what can textile archaeology tell us about something like gender roles in the past?
That is a very interesting and, in a way, annoying question.
Yeah.
I would say that I have got since I started to work in this research field. I talk about the female weavers, I talk about the female spinners. Of course, we know that in societies and different cultures, men have also played an important role in the production of textiles. Many of the written sources talk about the female workers when it comes to textiles and so on. But I find it very interesting because we have not a problem to talk about the male smith, for example, or the trader who was a man. No one questioned that. But as soon as we come to textiles and I talk about the female weaver, how can you say that? How do you know that?
Yeah.
So that is a question that is a little bit provocative.
It's controversial.
Yeah, it is. And it's because it's considered to be a female craft, while we do not question male crafts as according to my opinion, the same way. And I feel sometimes, because I'm coming from a family, a heritage where we have women back to the 18th century that were very famous for their fantastic textiles that they produced.
Okay.
So I have a feeling of if women now were very good at producing textiles, let them be proud of it, and let us be proud of the women that produce those textiles. And why don't we talk about the weaver's burial, for example?
Yeah, instead of the smith's burial or something.
Yeah, we could do both.
I think when we think about textiles, you're right, we think very much about a workforce that was predominantly female. I think it's also because we have a tendency to look at selected areas of a very long chaîne opératoire. Because if you think of textile as something that started in a field, from growing the plant all the way to the traders, the tailors, the traders, all the recycling also, sort of like second-hand market, until very recently in many economies. Then it becomes a much more sort of like gender balance situation where different genders maybe intervene at different time, and that again is defined differently depending on the society you're studying. So it's not just or only a female arena. That said, and I think it's also very important to say that through history, textile production has been sort of like a mean of emancipation for many women, including in antiquities, when we do have letters, for example, or of wives that were weaving at home and sending their production to be sold. Also, maybe the trader was a man, but they certainly had a very strong opinion on how much money he should get for their production and what kind of wool he should bring back so that she could weave something. So it's not just a passive thing. There is a huge space for creation, for talent, and definitely economic role in this.
And that is so very, very, very right. I mean, as you say, everybody in a household production was involved in textile production in one way or the other.
Including children in many ways.
Oh, yeah. No matter what sort of society you live in, once you're past a specific stage of development, everyone would have had a need for textiles and have been involved with it at some level.
I think much of this also changed with the industrialization of textiles when the men, there we can say men, I think, the people that own the fabric, they wanted people to buy the textiles from the industry, so to say. And everything that was made at home suddenly was considered badly made.
Second-hand product.
Exactly. And that has become a true. And that is also how when we sometimes in archaeology, like that men were the craftspeople, and everything that women did at home and had a living on is not visible the same way as the guilds, for example.
Now, I'm no expert, but I've gathered that one very significant thing that we can use ancient textiles for is to help us trace things like trade and long-distance connections and networks across the ancient world. How does this show up in textile archaeology?
Again, I think it is the interdisciplinarity and the combination and compare textiles from different places and different time periods and so on, and to understand where the textiles were produced and how they were traded. And for example, there have been a debate since the 1930s on Birka, that is the Swedish Viking town, where there is a lot of textile fragments found in the burials, around 4,500 fragments. And they were considered, as soon as they were found, as imports, because they were of such a high quality. And there was a big debate until the end of the 90s, maybe still a debate, of where those textiles were traded from. Suggested Palmyra, Friesland, Norway, UK.
So anything you could imagine, really.
Exactly, except
local production.
Exactly. But when we then studied the tool told a very different story. The tool told us that the textiles could actually have been produced at this place in Birka, because there were special tools for this very special production.
That's really interesting. So there's not been a final conclusion on this. It's a almost 100-year-old debate now. Or...
Yeah. I think we do agree today that there have been a production of high-quality textiles in Birka. But with that said, of course, there have also been a trade. I mean, we do have in Viking Age Scandinavia, especially in Birka, we have a lot of silk. And silk has been traded.
Yeah. That's not even possible for local production.
But that is, again, it's so important to look at the resources that we have.
The whole picture.
The whole picture, yes, exactly.
And that's something very much, especially when you start considering like long distance, anything really, that becomes very important to look at different stages of the chaîne opératoire. To make a textile, you need a lot of different steps to transform the raw material into the final product. And at each step, you can actually have phenomenon of trade, of exchanges, of knowledge. The raw material can move around. New tools can also come into the sort of like local toolkit. New people, new knowledge can be applied, and also entire final textiles or even final product can be exchanged. So it's actually sometimes quite difficult to pinpoint what is it that I'm looking at. Did they import only a raw material and produced it locally according to local codes? Or did they import a final piece? And that means different things, of course, at each time, in a way that the local population kind of develop their own sort of like textile repertoire.
Yeah.
So it becomes quite important to map these sort of things at each stages, and to be very well aware that sometimes you can't know. To look at different types of methods that could eventually at one point answer these questions.
Yeah.
And that's one of the reasons why I think it has been very, very beneficial for the textile archaeology community to really actually grow together, have a lot of conferences and workshops and shared projects, because we've really, in the past 20 years or so, learned much more about what was happening in the textile world across vast areas. So we feel much less isolated with our quotation mark, our material, and we can actually start discussing and comparing and have a much better, like, wider understanding of these sometimes very long networks.
I just wanted to say that this working together, even if we are working with different time periods and areas, it has been, for me personally, extremely important. I have learned so much. I've been working in one project on the textile trade between Assur and Kültepe-Kanesh 2000 BC, and all the written sources that they have in this cuneiform writing, for example, that have also given me some strength. And I'm coming back to Scandinavia, working with Viking Age to understand how much textiles that must have been produced, even if we don't have the written sources.
Yeah.
And if we take one example, for example, the sailcloth that was needed in the late Iron Age, Viking Age, I mean, it takes a lot of raw materials and people to produce a sailcloth equally to the production of a ship.
Yeah.
And that is not something that was one person or one farm's task. It must have been organized. And that is something that is new to discuss the organization of textile production, even if we do not have the written sources.
So what's been one of the most surprising or unexpected discoveries that you've had in your own research on textiles, or in the field, if you've had any there?
For me, I don't think it's one thing, so to say, one experience. I think referring to what Elsa said, how textile research has developed from being something just studied the textiles themselves, the fragments, to include the context, include the tools to this development. And we are just started.
Yeah, there's still a long way to go.
There is still a long way to go, but we have come quite far. And the most important for me is to integrate it in archaeology.
Yeah, it's difficult to pinpoint one area. I guess I can give you like two examples. For me, one, I guess, foundational part of my research was when I was working on cotton, because by studying textiles made of cotton, it was all of a sudden much more like tangible to start thinking about cotton domestication and much sort of like larger archaeological phenomenon that were not really studied before. And then, of course, working with archaeobotanists and people who understand much broader phenomenon, the dispersion of domesticated plants in Africa or things like that, much broader than the small piece of textile that I was looking at.
Yeah. And
then to start working with this very large network that cross the entire old world. We're talking about species crossing continents and having a major impact on the agricultural life of people all the way to their use. So that's kind of like one thing that I really, really enjoyed doing that had a great impact on my research in general. And maybe one that's more selfish, I would say, maybe, was I had the great luck at one point to work with a garment, a cotton still, a skirt that was preserved in situ on a naturally mummified body of a woman from Sudan. And this was also for me sort of like not a turning point, but a bit of to be honest, a dream come true to have the chance to really, it's very nosy, right? This sort of like attraction that one can have when you do archaeology to be able to like touch the past.
Yeah, work hands-on, of course. It anchors you in your field.
And it was really the person, her skirt still arranged around their hips, and it was such an intimate experience that really kind of like marked me in a way.
Yeah, that's so nice. I love the emotional side of it as well, because there are, with the amount of time and energy that past people have put into this, of course there's going to be some emotion left over, and you can sort of see the care and dedication in the fabric that you're working with. So what are you most excited about when it comes to the future of textile archaeology? What new developments are you keeping an eye on?
There are so many. There are so many different developments that we could and that we are integrating in textile research. A lot of them have something to do with natural sciences and heritage science as a big umbrella that goes from ancient DNA and protein analysis for species identifications or things like that. Personally, I am maybe very excited to see what we could do with, I suppose, this type of what our colleagues here have called clothromics. So the ancient DNA and protein analysis, but to go beyond the, let's say, the pure identification of the species, to use textile to better understand these broader sort of movements when it comes to animal practices. How, for example, a sheep was reared to produce the type of wool that people needed. So how sort of like people engineered the animal and plant species around them to feed the textile economy. I am really interested about what we could bring with this, especially in context of my work in African archaeology, because it's not something that was done before. But I have to say that I'm also very excited about very basic things, not necessarily, new methods. I am really, really excited to see more data coming in about places where we maybe did not know as much. I'm excited about doing also more training and like build a practice, for example, in ancient Egyptian textile production. And that doesn't necessarily involve a lot of newfangled methods, but just the multiplication of state-of-the-art analysis on fantastic material that is for now very often sleeping in storage in museums worldwide.
Yeah, there is a lot that can be said about different wishes and so on. I would say my wish would be to continue to work with the people that produce the textiles and to learn more about the organization of textile production and to raise that. We do have so many methods today that it will be possible, but it takes time to put all the different things together. As Elsa said, the field is already there, but still we need more textile researchers. That is clear. There is so much work to be done. And I think for me, one of my wishes is that we could really have a good education. We have a lot of interest from both men and women about textiles and textile archaeology. And to have an education for that would be absolutely fantastic.
To raise a new generation.
Yeah, we need a new generation. I have been involved in PhD positions that have had very few applicants because the applicants haven't had the right skills to have such a position. That's really, really sad. And there is so much material. And the more research we do, the more material is coming up, more questions are asked.
All right, so that takes us to almost the end of this episode. I have a final question before I let you go, which is if there's one thing that you each wish that more people understood about textiles in the ancient world, in the past, what would that be?
Just one thing?
Just one thing.
I would wish that textile archaeology was accepted as all archaeology. If it's come to flint, ceramic, you name it. It's just another piece of people's everyday life. That would be my wish.
It's difficult to top that up, isn't it?
Yeah, that sort of summed everything up pretty nicely.
Yeah, one thing that I wish people understood when they were hopefully, finding and paying attention to textiles in archaeology is that it's not just about the object, it's not just about the textile in front of them, it's about the entire network of people and resources that were necessary to create that. And that, in a way, is another version of what Eva just said, that it is one piece of the puzzle of ancient lives. So it's not just about textiles, and maybe we should stop saying, textile archaeology as a hyper-specialized and technique field. It's not. It's documenting a part of material culture to learn more about people.
Yep.
Yeah. Just like any other branch of archaeology.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Just like any other branch of archaeology.
Yeah.
Great. That takes us to the end of this episode. Elsa and Eva, thank you both so much for coming on the show today. It's been amazing to have you in the studio.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
And thank you, dear listener, for tuning in to this episode of Let's Dig Deeper. I hope you've learned lots and that you're maybe thinking more about the fabrics that you wear on your own body. If you have any questions or suggestions for the podcast, you can reach us at letsdigdeeperpodcast@gmail.com. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast so that you never miss an episode. And please rate us 5 stars so that we can reach more people. You can find us on social media under the name Let's Dig Deeper. I am Zinat Haroun and I've been your host. You can reach me on Instagram at @z_archaeology. Thanks for tuning in. I'll see you next time where we will dig deeper into another topic. Bye!